webinar topic is role of mass communication in healthcare. So we have a perfect speaker for this topic, and he is Mr. Suresh Kochattil. He is an amalgamation of various sectors and industries. He has been a media professional for over 3 decades with experience in print, digital, and television media. He has spent the last decade with Apollo Foundation, and with such a vast experience, he has also mentored over a dozen startups, mostly in the healthcare and IT space. So, without any further ado, I would like to invite Mr. Suresh for the webinar. And just to all the attendees, keep the session very engaging, as Mr. Suresh always likes questions to be asked. Over to you, Mr. Suresh.
Thank you very much. And are you clear? Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Fine, perfect. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining this particular webinar here. And as was described in my introduction, I've spent over the last 33 years now in the media sector, ranging from the hospitality to the healthcare sector, and in between print, media, and now in television. I've spent 10 years in the Apollo Hospitals group before I ventured out into other ventures. I left Apollo in 2017. But those 10 years have been a great learning experience for me, both on the BPO side, as well as the CSR side, and in between on the digital front. The learnings were immense. But what I'm going to bring to you here today is what I see often in the healthcare sector, and nothing reference to any particular hospital or healthcare system for that matter. I'm talking from a layman's perspective, from purely what happens, what goes wrong with mass communications, or what goes right with mass communication in healthcare. Now, quite a lot of you might be asking this question to yourself: why do you think mass communication? And I think I should reword it as communication in healthcare, because it is not just mass, we have a bit of class also in between. That is because often the case, healthcare gets a short shrift when it comes to communication. The communication is usually top down. It's driven by the bosses as to what is to be said and when it is to be said. And that is one of the first failures of healthcare communication. Because as is often the case, many of the media that interact with healthcare professionals interact at the low levels. That is, they interact at the front-facing levels. And that is where majority of the mistakes happen, because these staff are not trained to speak to media, and they don't even know they're speaking. Sometimes it must be a hidden camera somewhere. Somebody comes to the hospital to ask a question, and unknowingly the front answers the question. And that becomes a bigger issue later on for the management. That is because we don't empower the staff down the line. We don't train them how to answer the questions. And we don't tell them how to diplomatically avoid answering certain questions. Because quite often, if you say no comments, that is more than enough to take care of your issue. But as is often the want, people tend to speak because they think that they need to speak. And that is where the majority of the mistakes happen. So my question, obviously, to all of you, and I'd like to keep this interactive. I don't like all the questions coming up towards the last, because that becomes a kind of a, bunch of questions that people don't get. So anywhere you feel ask that question, please ask the moderator to I'm sure she will bring in the question. Now, let's talk about what to speak about. And as is often the case, as I told you earlier, it gets pushed into one corner because communication is not a priority in healthcare. Saving lives is a priority. And quite often when it happens with that, the doctors, the medical professionals, rightly so, get the prominence in the healthcare sector. It is very rare that you see a hospital interacting with the media, but for, say, a particular operation done in a particular manner or particular treatment done in a particular manner, where a patient who had a liver transplant or something very risky procedure which the hospital wants to showcase. And that is where the hospital brings in this particular image that they want to convey. But I tell this to many of my friends, many of my colleagues in the sector, various sectors. It need not be healthcare. It can be anything. interact with the media when you don't need to interact with them. That is important. Because quite often, when they need to interact, and that is where the mistake happens. You bunch up 30, 40 people from the press, from the television, print, and digital, everybody into a room, and you talk about the exploits of what you have done. Well, the media is kind of not forced to, but they come there because it's a PR kind of event which needs to be covered. They'd like to be in the good books of the hospital management. The hospital management would like to keep them in good humor. And that is when the publicity happens. One day later, everything comes in the print and television. Everybody goes home happy. But is that what healthcare communication is all about? No. You need to communicate with the service provider, the print, the television, everybody. And I mean, being a media professional myself for a long time, I often feel that when I'm grouped with the people, 30, 40 people in a room, I don't get to get a priority. I don't get the personal preference that I would like to directly talk to the MD or the top doctors of the hospitals. I'm bunched up with the rest of the people. So the first example would be call these healthcare professionals, should call the doctors or be the management, call the media people one by one on particular days of the week. There are 365 days in a year, and you can surely call each media once in a year and speak to them personally on a one-to-one basis. That's extremely important. Because when you speak on a one-to-one basis, what effectively happens is that the media professional gets the importance that he or she needs to be given. They can ask the right questions that they need to ask. There are very few people in the media side who are trained in healthcare reporting. I mean, there are very few magazines or even tabloids, you can call them, that are there catering to the healthcare part of it in India. And rightly so, because of that, they don't know how to ask the right questions. This is where the medical education, the basic medical education for a media professional. So I would urge the hospitals to actually organize a one-day workshop for media professionals. I mean, how about each hospital doing it in their own geography? Call about 10 or 20 media professionals, have a half a day. Now that the sector is opened up, now that people have started traveling, you can call all people, or 25 people in a particular city or a town where you are, and brief them on healthcare. Don't talk about your hospital, because that is not what they want to listen to. They would like to know as to what is happening in the healthcare sector. Today everybody talks on COVID and other things. But remember, at the end of the day, healthcare is all about trust. And keeping that trust on makes a major difference to the image of the hospital. And that is one way you can start, is by building a relationship in teaching the journalists who want to specialize in healthcare reporting the basics of healthcare. Basics. You don't need to get into the complicated stuff. They just need to know what are the major advances happening, what's a robotic surgery, how does a dialysis machine work, how does an MRI work, for example, what is a CT scan all about. These are the things that need to be taught to the healthcare, to the media professionals. Now, problem with all this is that everybody is busy. Nobody has the time for it, but I'm sure you can actually spare one day in a year to train this professional. And I've seen this happening in, say, a sector like NTPC, where I am often called to give guest lectures once in a year. And that happens, they club all the reporters from the neighboring areas of that NTPC plant and bring them into the NTPC campus, have a 2-hour, 3-hour session on the media, in which various experts from print, television, and people like me from the other media also kind of get in and speak about various facets. There is a mute that mic. Now I'm coming to the second point of what I'm going to bring in actually, and that you're going to key in healthcare sector actually. And can you go to the next? Hello. Yeah, okay. I'll ask my moderator to bring in the next slide into the presentation. Okay, now the major part that I want to communicate to many people out here is the fact that media can make or break reputations overnight. And that is very, very important. Because quite often we see that media's reputation is made or spoiled in a matter of seconds. So when the next slide comes up, you will see that headline that I'm talking about. Is media can make reputations happen overnight and it can spoil the entire thing overnight. Now, be the celebrity or a brand doesn't matter, but it can happen anytime. I'm not able to put the slide, so I will ask them out. And anyway, so be it a celebrity or a brand, as I was speaking to you about, one needs to move the one needs to make sure that the edifice doesn't crumble overnight, and that is important. So, yes, now I've got the slide. So, media can make or break reputations overnight. That's what I was telling you, because if you're a celebrity or a brand, your reputation can get squandered away in a day. Forget a day, it can get squandered away in a matter of minutes. Today, healthcare is the same bucket of things. We see that healthcare can also be having the reputation shattered. What they built over 30, 40 years can just go away overnight. Now, would you, as a healthcare provider, have been in such a situation? Because how does one ensure that this does not happen? And as I said before, the key to it is keeping the communication channel open. Because you need to be honest about what you know. And quite often, hospitals are accused, rightly or wrongly, that they're hiding back information. Now, it can range from very, very small things like a billing to a status of a patient in ICU. And I'll take it up more in detail as we go along. But we saw that happen during this current COVID crisis, both in the first wave and the second wave. We saw a lot of information being hidden away from people. People were running pillar to post trying to get information about their loved ones. The doctors were stretched, the nurses were stretched, the technical staff was stretched. Everybody was working hard. You can't blame anybody. But in a normal parlance in a hospital, when the COVID situation has actually cooled down, we need to keep the windows of communication open. And this is very, very important. Because don't try to fight after the damage is done. Because one person who's dissatisfied with your service can go out and create chaos. And that person will go and talk to 100 other people. And before you know, as I said, your reputation is in tatters. So whatever you built up the image in 30, 40 years, rightly or wrongly will go away in a matter of just a few hours. So my request, my take to the entire professionals who are working in the healthcare sector, especially those who are facing the media and those who are not facing the media also, is that be truthful to what you're saying. Now, I know there are certain restrictions in that, certain things cannot be said. But what often happens is that the management, the top management takes a call saying, we will speak to the media, nobody else will speak to the media. And that is a major, major mistake. The moment you do that, what happened effectively is that the staff lower down the line cannot answer certain questions. They're not allowed to answer certain questions. And that is where the problem starts happening. And my main take on this is allow and empower your staff. Tell them what they can say, what they cannot say. And for anything and everything, there should be a 24/7 response center. Somebody who can take calls from media, somebody who can take calls from even the people who are standing in front of you. And that is where the entire problem can be sorted out. But quite often, as I say in media, no news is not good news. Sometimes you say, I don't have anything to comment on this. So somebody asks you a certain question saying, XYZ celebrity is admitted in your hospital. Can I know the health status of that patient? Now, the top management has given out an instruction, and we saw this in numerous cases, including a former chief minister who was admitted to a certain hospital down south. There are many movie stars who get admitted, and quite often there's a lot of media pressure at that point in time. Or it can be somebody who was involved in an accident at a site, work site, and brought to the hospital. These crises always happen. And when there's a moment in crisis, that is when the hospital needs to stand up. The healthcare system needs to stand up. And let me broad-base my argument saying, not just a hospital, but the entire healthcare ecosystem needs to stand up. And trumpeting good news, as I said before, you've done something wonderful. The surgery was done, some kind of rare work was done in the healthcare sector. You call up the entire media and put the patient in front of you and you say, this is what happened. This is how the patient came in and we kind of did this 13-hour or 14-hour surgery and we saved his life and now he or she can go back to normal. Now that is a kind of taken thing that happens often. But what happens is when bad news comes, how do you handle bad news? And quite often that is the case when everybody disappears. As I say, often accidents happen on a Saturday night at 2 o'clock. I mean, there's a research world over, and they say most of the accidents, industrial accidents, happen on either on a Saturday night or a Sunday night. So then there's nobody around in that facility, and that's when the accidents happen, and nobody is there to answer questions after. So my take to media professionals who are handling healthcare is to ensure that you keep the channels open. Say there is no news to be said right now. You can always keep the media is hungry for news. So if you don't give them news, what effectively happens is the media person actually creates his or her own news. And that is even more dangerous, especially when they have no knowledge of healthcare. As I told you before, unless you train them, they have no idea what a bariatric surgery is to what a cardiac surgery. They have no idea. Hello. Okay. So now coming back to the discussion again on no news is not good news, is ensure that even the bad news gets conveyed, and that is important. How do you convey a bad news? So there has to be a professional system of even drafting a press note, for example. Sometimes there has to be the health updates that are to be given every 6 hours in case of a kind of a celebrity patient that is there in your hospital. Or, as I said before, there's some accident cases that are pulled in. So ensure that there is a system, there is a process by which this message gets conveyed. In simple language, the press, the media, the television doesn't like complicated words. They like things being said in a very, very simple manner. So forget the medical jargon, come down to the basics, talk the basics, and tell them what the situation is. Because as I said before, if you don't do that, media will create their own news. Their own news, they'll put 2 plus 2 and make it 5 and broadcast it or print it. And then you'll be left running, trying to salvage the situation from there on. So kind of prevention is better than cure, as I say in the medical terminology. So here it holds very, very good. Now, it's important. Healthcare organizations need to be open and transparent. I made a brief mention of this before. Now, what happens often is that healthcare organizations, I'm not saying you're not transparent, you are transparent. But what happens is that to ensure this channel is kept open, do have good news and bad news. And I said before, and I said this again and again, I'll say this, is call media when you don't need them. They'll also be surprised when you call them. Tell them, just come and let's have a cup of tea. My MD wants to have a cup of tea with you, or my CEO wants to have a cup of tea, or my operations head wants to have a cup of tea, or my head of cardiac surgery wants to have a cup of tea with you. Let's catch up over lunch. That is when you build up the rapport. That is when the media person feels that he or she is kind of on a one-to-one basis. And this is where it's very important. And I said before, this is nothing to do with healthcare per se. It is there for every other industry. Because that's often the mistake. You call media only when you need them, but call media even when you don't need them. Second point on this entire thing is don't bluff. If you try to lie in one place, you will get caught later. This is the age of information, where a patient inside the hospital can actually transmit the news to the outside the hospital. And we saw this during the COVID first wave, and especially during the second wave, where patients actually used their mobile phones to record their own messages, where they were in distress, rightly so, and they conveyed the news outside. It did huge damage to the hospital concern, many of them. And I'll take it up separately by way of what happened in Delhi and other cities during the second wave. Now, quite often the question, even I get calls sometimes asking me for a particular patient in a hospital in Hyderabad or any other place, saying that, sir, this patient is in this ICU for the last 1 week. We have no updates from the hospital. Now, that is a question as to whom do you convey these updates? Because medical ethics being medical ethics, you cannot convey the news of a patient to anybody and everybody. There has to be somebody who's a blood relative or as per the legal requirement has to be told to that person. But make sure that you tell it. Otherwise, again, what happens is that there is a lot of speculation that happens. And rightly or wrongly, hospitals are often accused of keeping a patient on ventilators, for example. I faced a situation when I was working in many other institutions, that you are told a patient is in the ventilator. So the assumption for an outsider is, we are trying to save lives. But for a layman, he thinks that the hospital has just put a dead patient on the ventilator. And that's it. I mean, that is a wrong connotation. So again, the damage being done to the healthcare organization is huge. We need to be honest and transparent and tell the people who need to know as to what is happening. Now, hiding bad news is one of the things that we need to take it in a virtual reflex in most organizations, because thoughtful readers often recognize that speaking up early and truthfully is a vital strategy in a fast-moving crisis. Now your hospital gets 40 patients from a liquor tragedy. Okay, all the 40 are pushed in, wheeled in. There is emergency service. People are lying in the corridor. People are being pushed, wheeled in. Everything happening. Now the question often would be, what do you do in that circumstances? Okay, so this is where I actually want to open it up and ask people. I mean, many of you would be having some questions that you would like to ask us. So I would be more than happy to take those questions from you, and let me just kind of get those questions so that I can answer them as I go on, please. I'm just opening up the chat mode to see the questions that you have. Yes, let me start. Yeah, I have Munim Farzan, who is from Hyderabad, Telangana, B.Pharm student, but there's no question there. Then been in communication, says Vivekanand, and is now involved with the Medical Foundation. Dr. Soumya says, I'm a BUMS and I'm looking to build my career in medical writing. I'm sure Vishy and his team at InFocus RX and can help with that question. I'm sure they'll take it offline. Mass communication. Hi, Divya. I'm a freelance writer. I'm really interested to know in detail about how mass communication can help Delva. I think I've been talking about that, Divya, and if you have anything specific within that part of it, I'm glad to take it up. Then I see Jyotisha from Ahmedabad, who's come in with a question. Yeah. See, is it ethical for media to make up news? Is there no moral code to be followed? Now, this is a $1 million question. And if I knew the answer to this, I would be a millionaire. The question is, what is moral standards? Remember that we accuse each other of these things. There is the media that happens from the press. They say the hospital or the healthcare institution is not being truthful. They make their own news. They say that since you're not truthful, I'll write what I want. True. The media is today actually trying to get news when there's no news. And that nothing better than healthcare crisis for them to make news. So I'm sure, as you see in your question that you're asking about moral standards, the question of morality is kind of there, taken in the society, but as is often the case, morality is a very, very thin line. You don't know where you stand sometimes. So I can't answer for sure. I'm sure that it happens with both of us in terms of answering questions on the morality part of it. The press is equally guilty, and I feel the media is kind of taking up things which they should not be taking up. But at the same time, the healthcare institutions need to be ensured. I mean, that is what I was telling you. You need to ensure that you keep the window of communication open. Because the moment you start denying the news to certain media houses, and I'm talking of the big ones, there are many small media houses I know who indulge in certain practices which are not in conformity with what many of us in media would do. But what happens often with the big media houses is that they tend to directly contact someone within the institution. And if they don't get a response, they get pretty angry, and then they go and create their own news. Morality is a question which I have. I think it's there in the hospital sector, healthcare sector too. And it is there in the media sector. So we need to it claps with both the hands, unless you do it together, you cannot get a kind of response that you're asking for. I can see one more question that has popped up. One moment, please. Yeah, I think I'll get on to the thing. Many people are asking about how to get into freelance writing. I'm sure that those answers can come in later. But I'm sure that I want to learn mass communication to upgrade myself as health inspector. That's the last slide I have in this particular presentation. So I'm sure I'll come to that when we see those points coming up as to how to make a career in healthcare writing, if you want to call it, in the media sector. So there is one more question from Divya, which says that, as you said, media is making news when news is not there. So how can healthcare professionals use media to communicate the right news and aid people to know the right news, especially in the corona scenario? Okay, fine. That's a good question to ask, because the COVID has taught us a lot of lessons. I think the Indian healthcare sector will never be the same again after COVID. I mean, we had things like, before crisis, BC and then AD. Now we have before Corona and after Corona. So what we learned in before Corona scenario, we can be any sector for that. There's no sector that the COVID has not impacted. Every sector has been impacted, including healthcare in a big, big way. So the lessons that we learned are still being learned, analyzed, and deciphered by experts. And I'm sure as we go along, as we get into the further stages post-COVID, the main problem that we do is that in COVID scenario, and I'll take that in a separate slide. I don't want to preempt it right now by giving out answers, but Divya, your question, the answer to your question is coming up soon. And if you have more of the questions, I'm sure we can take it offline. You can come on the chat and you can ask this question. Right now, let me get back to the presentation itself. And keeping the information channels open, healthcare in terms of being open and transparent. Well, as I told you, unless you do that, quite often the front-facing stuff, and this is where I have a grouse. And I'll take an example of it. The sector that is best equipped in this is the airline industry. Now, when you go to a check-in counter at the airport, and often there are some issue at the check-in counter. It might be an overweight baggage, or it might be a problem with the booking or the seating arrangement that you have on the aircraft, which you had booked, and the staff says, oh, it's moved from a Boeing to an ATR, so we don't have a 3+3 combination, we have a 2+2 combination, so your seat configuration has changed. Now, over the years, airlines, and it started with the Scandinavian airline system way back when I was studying, we were taught that that is the world's best example of service delivery. The SAS, as it was popularly called. There was a CEO at that time, I forget his name right now, but he turned the airline into its head by empowering the frontline staff to answer the question. I don't mean front office, I mean the front line. So it can be a nurse, it can be a technical assistant, because sometimes the patient's relatives often ask these people, what is going to happen next? Is my relative okay? Now, this person may or may not answer the question, but the airline industry, the Scandinavian airlines system turned that thing around its head and said, let the frontline staff answer the question. They might make a mistake or two, but we will back them. And that is where the hospital managements need to make a change. They need to train the frontline staff, because these are the people quite often who the patient relatives are in touch. And that is where the media also gets in touch sometimes. They don't directly call the MD of the hospital and ask questions. They might call somebody whom they know and say, what is happening there? I mean, then they get a very, very vague answer. And then they say, okay, fine, these guys are not interested, so I'll write my own story. And this is where the dangerous part comes in. Okay, let me just go on to the next slide, please. Okay, the thing that often is said, mass media is a change agent or a reinforcing agent. Now, over the years, the definition of mass media itself has changed. The good old days, we had print media, which is the number one. This is the newspapers, the magazines, the fortnightlies, everything. But since the television came in, the newspaper industry by itself, the print industry, started declining big time. It was very obvious because today's generation doesn't read a newspaper. They don't read, they don't watch a television. I'm talking of the 18 to 24 age group or 28 age group at the maximum. So where do they watch? What do they see? Is a question that we all need to ask us. So the change agent that we are talking of, the mass media, is today can influence generations which don't read or don't watch television. Most of these youngsters today are hooked onto social media. I will take that up separately in another slide. But here we're talking of a change agent. Now, how do you ensure change agent? That is people's opinion about a healthcare organization as to what they can do and what they cannot do. Now, quite often, as I've been telling you people, after all, who will go on a limb and that limb is likely to cut under them? And that is where the front office, the frontline staff makes a difference. So change agent in terms of ensuring an image change comes from mass media. They have that responsibility. But the problem, as often is the case, is that mass media itself doesn't know what to do. And somebody was asking me the question, that the situation arises when they dig unnecessary questions which is not needed. That's one of the questions that is coming up. It's good, it's correct. And add up they assume and portray it to the common public. After providing the proper drafting of the press note, does the media disseminate the exact note or report and provide them to the common public? No, this press note itself is a Jurassic thing. At one time, when I was the print industry, I'm talking of the 1990s, the early 1990s to 2007, when I worked for 17 years in the print industry in the Times India. Press notes were a big thing. The media used to clamor for press notes, and that is where the entire thing was right. A lot of effort used to be taken by the top management and the PR team of the hospital to sit and actually write down the entire thing as to how to, write this press note, and it should say exactly what it says and not a word beyond what it should say. But does the media know what to write from that? Now, that is why I said you have to be a reinforcing agent. You have to ensure that the media, mass media, is a reinforcing agent. It actually takes a message and reinforces that message. Now, unless you teach the mass media, you can't teach them through a press note. You can't teach the journalists through a press note as to what is written and what is wrong, because they look beyond the press note. Because in your press note, you want to say only what you want. On the other hand, the media wants to know what you don't want to say. And that is where the conflict comes in. And quite often I've seen many a PR manager tear their hair out saying, no, this is not what we told the media, but they've written something totally different. It happens. And this is exactly why it happens. Shravani, I hope I answered your question on that. But let me come back to affecting knowledge, attitudes, and behavior towards products and services. Now, let us not again take hospitals as an example. I would take a OP as an example. Now, quite often patients come to the OP and are made to wait for, say, 2 hours, 2.5 hours, depending on the doctor's schedule, the rush that the doctor, how popular the doctor is. In the modern parlance today, when we have an appointment system, which is there, which I worked on my early days at Apollo, was a system where we had Apollo eDoc at that time, what it was called, where the patient could schedule an information. Now it has gone steps ahead, and it has jumped huge steps ahead. And it today ensures that a patient can come in exactly when he or she needs to come in. Not, they don't need to come and wait, because these days, and especially these days of COVID, waiting in a hospital is not the most pleasant experience. So we need to ensure that the patient comes in at the time when they need to come in. So affecting the knowledge, attitudes, and behavior toward products and services. You don't go to a restaurant and wait for 1 hour. You make a booking before going there and saying, I'm coming at X time with so many people and I need a table for 4, a table for 8. Something similar with the hospital. Now again, in terms of professionalism, don't expect a patient to be professional, because quite often a hospital is not a hotel. Okay, they come to get an illness treated. So when they come to get an illness treated, they are already under stress. So don't add more stress onto them. So the mass media's job is to educate people on how a hospital system works. And they need to be a change agent or a reinforcing agent, as the case may be. And definitely, you as a professional, many of you who are on the PR side, on the hospital side, and the management side, need to ensure that you actually build that network, which is why I keep coming back to the same point. Be in touch with the media 24/7. Don't let just your PR person be in touch with the media. You also should be on a first name basis with them. Not with everybody. I know that you will say there are hundreds of media guys. You pick and choose the ones that make the maximum impact, and definitely give some importance to them. Send them regular notes on what's happening on various healthcare issues, not just a press note when you need to send it to them. That is the most important thing. Let me go on to the next slide, please. Yeah. This is my favorite slide, because quite often, social media today has become the be-all and end-all of healthcare. And why do we say that? Because quite often, today a patient knows more about the disease than the doctor does. And I've heard this from many a doctor. Because the patient goes through Google, searches everything out, decides what the disease is all about, knows what the cure is, knows what's going to be prescribed, everything. And then they come and tell the doctor, I think this is what I'm suffering from, and this is what I think you must be inferring, and this is the prescription I think I'm going to get. The doctor often is at a wit's end saying, what do I do? Now, that is a positive and a good thing that we see today, but the doctor also has a sense of humor to understand it. But where the damage the social media does today is that it is the primary mode of communication. A mobile phone, a person with a mobile phone and agenda is extremely dangerous, because quite often somebody comes with his phone with the camera switched on and enters the hospital, and he can or she can record anything under the sun and make a story out of it. Now, you can't understand. You can't. Social media is all powerful. So how do we ensure that that doesn't happen? That uh, I see an echo coming somewhere. Okay. Yeah. So the question that often comes up is, how do you handle social media? Now, I've heard this from professional managers across various sectors saying, you know what, these guys on social media wrote something about my product, and before I could react, there were 101 comments on that, and people started making their own influence. Now, quite often I give an example of the Cadbury chocolate issue. Many of you must be aware what happened with that. Nothing to do with healthcare sector, but just to give you an idea. Now, when it happened, when it really happened as a sector, there were worms that came inside the chocolate. Now it became a big issue, but within 24 hours, Cadbury's reacted. They pulled out all the stocks from their shops. They got Amitabh Bachchan to do a visit to the factory as a brand manager. They put a new packaging in place, and within 1 week, they had new set of chocolates back on the shelves. Now that is an instant reaction of how professionally a company should deal with a crisis. And in the healthcare sector, many of us, now I would slightly delve out of the healthcare sector because reputation is a long-term game, Taking a reputational hit today from the release of bad news is likely to earn for the management, the organizations, and even nations today. You see what happened with COVID. We got walloped during the second phase, the entire world from New York Times to Washington Post to Economist. Everybody wrote how India was, how people were dying on the streets and all that. Today, US has over 1 lakh COVID cases every day. Do we hear anything similar? No. In Florida, there are no ICU beds left anymore. There are just 4 or 5 left last evening. And there are thousands of patients waiting. Did we hear any negative news from there? No. The media has an axe to grind. I'm right. I agree with many of the comments that are coming up on the chat. Media has an axe to grind. They will, for example, the international media will like to show India as a land where the cows walk on the street and where the snake charmers are still working on the magic. That is what the image of India they need to want to convey. But is India that? No, we are far beyond. And I think our doctors, our healthcare system, our nurses, everybody, the paramedicals, everybody handled the COVID second wave admirably well. I don't think there is any country in this world which has handled it better than India. True, we had a lot of lessons to be learned from that. We were learned it. There was this oxygen crisis that was created. Rightly or wrongly again. That is again a classic example I would like to give. I wouldn't like to name the hospital, but there's one hospital in Delhi which went to the Delhi High Court and said, we have 14 to 15 people dying in the last 1 hour due to lack of oxygen. The court immediately took up and ordered extra oxygen to be sent to that hospital. It was sent, but those tankers were standing outside. Now, then recently when the question came up in the Lok Sabha about the same number of patients dying because of lack of oxygen in Delhi, this hospital showed 0. So what effectively happened is that news which was conveyed to the media there that day through the courts was totally wrong. And now that hospital management is in trouble because either they lied then or they lied now. So this is where I'm coming again into the entire thing. These dividends which come in form of a future reputational gain, these are all future gains that you're going to make. The hospital has already built up a brand name for itself. Benefits that come from internal and external, your external audience, your internal audience, which is your employees, and what you say will bring forth the commitment and the confidence to solving the problem. Because quite often, every one of us is fighting a battle every day, and hospitals also are fighting a battle. They're not just saving the patients, there are many other issues they're handling, including what you're speaking to. It's about media. And social media today, one has to learn to live with. I'm very happy because I deal with a lot of my friends in the PR as well as in the hospital sector who handle the media. And they often tell me that the main thing they look for today is social media because they keep the phones on, they check Facebook, they check Twitter to ensure that the negative comments about the hospital or the positive comments about the hospital, queries about the hospital are answered instantly. A patient asking for a query would not like to have the query's reply coming in next day. They will go and clobber you in the market. So that as a media professional, or a healthcare ecosystem, answer the queries immediately. Even if you don't have the answer, say that I will get back to you so that the person knows that somebody has seen the message and they would like to answer it. And ladies and gentlemen, being a media professional of standing for so many years, and I can tell you, There's nothing that stokes the ego of a media person than seeing a hospital or a healthcare system or even any other company being pillared. They like to see that happen because they are very happy with it. Because for media, bad news is good news. I mean, let us be very truthful of that fact because it sells. Bad news sells faster than good news. So definitely, the media would like to have, and I'll give you a few examples of it. When I talk of success stories about how healthcare companies used, I wouldn't like to name anything because I worked in a particular hospital group, as I told you, and I would like to, kind of clap over that. It was an extremely professional hospital group, and I'm glad that I'm very proud that I work for that group. But I'm going beyond it because they know how to handle media very well, but not many other hospitals do. Now let's look at each example. During the COVID, the first phase and now the second phase, there used to be a media briefing every day at 5. It still happens. We quite often we see Mr. Love Agarwal, who is the Joint Secretary in the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, actually making a briefing there. And quite often, you see a lot of media people attending those press conferences and asking questions. In the early days, the questions were very, very basic, and you used to laugh at the questions because people were asking very, very vain and inane. But as the time passed by, those same press people got educated more about what is COVID, how does it impact the lungs, what is the oxygen supply in each state. They got the numbers before coming for the press conference. So it became very professional in interacting. And if somebody can fault the Modi government for not handling the second phase well, I think that was made possible because the media was too kind of critical at that point in time without realizing that so-called oxygen crisis never actually happened. It was created with the intention. I'm not getting into the politics of it because I don't think that is the right forum to do it. But we saw the government handling it very well after that. And thankfully, India we are doing well in terms of vaccinations and also in terms of handling the cases, new cases, about averaging out 40,000, which is coming up today. The second part was the All India Institute of Medical Sciences briefing. Now, Dr. Guleria, who used to do it, he's also a part of the COVID task force there. So he addresses both the places. But there were certain places where he answered very well. For example, the query about third phase, the third wave that is coming up. There's a lot of people scaring people. Oh, the third wave is about to come. It's there near your doorstep. Your kids are going to be impacted. Worldwide, there was no research to show that kids were infected, are going to be infected. In fact, Dr. Guleria brought it up really well. He said, we don't have any such research. Now, that was reassuring to many parents because nothing more frightening than having your kids, getting COVID, infected by COVID. Because as an adult, your immune system is far more powerful. For kids, it is not. So that particular reassurance in 2 to 3 press conferences, he addressed one with the ministry briefing. He went back and addressed it one in the AIMS. Then he came on 2 of the television talk shows along with other doctors also from various hospitals who were continuously giving updates and saying, don't worry, we are in control. We are far better than what we are, the second wave now. The vaccinations are doing well. This is good news. The success stories of what I'm talking of. Because each hospital, I'm sure, can share the success stories in this forum. They can write back to the moderator of this forum saying, this is how we handled a crisis, so that it becomes a lesson. It becomes an example, a textbook example for others, how to respond to this crisis. If this hospital handled it this way, I'm sure we can also do it. So I urge the moderators of this conference to ensure that we ask for case studies of various hospitals of how they handle the particular crisis. Now, the WHO briefings, now that is the other end of it, how it was a flop show. The early days of the COVID crisis, I remember the first case in India came in January ending in Kerala, a girl who came from Wuhan. At that point in time, we were told it is not a transmittable disease. Nothing is wrong with it. It is a very localized stuff. So Kerala also assumed, because like the Nipah virus they had before, this is something very similar, because this also came from bats and all that kind of stuff. But later on, we learned the real impact of it when people in Wuhan started dropping dead like flies. The WHO still kept denying that there was a crisis. And I think that is the biggest blunder that the World Health Organization did. They should have acknowledged that they had a problem in hand, and they didn't do it. And that is where I'm saying handling media, because the media didn't ask tough questions then. God knows why, because maybe it's a one-way traffic. They were not allowed to. They were only allowed to listen or view, but not ask questions. But I think that was a big blunder that happened. But it has improved since then. things are far better right now in terms of what is happening on the healthcare side, especially the COVID part. Now, we also saw a case in the US. I don't know how many of you watched those foreign channels, but Dr. Fauci, who was the healthcare, who's still the advisor to the US president about COVID, he made a few controversial statements. President Trump ticked him off. Then President Trump ticked him off, said he would sack him. And those were disasters in press conferences. In India, you don't see that happening often because either our media is very docile, or they're too aggressive, or they don't know what questions to ask. And that is important, ladies and gentlemen, because if you know what to ask, and that is what one of the ladies who's in this chat asked me, how do you know? We give the thing to the media, but they publish something else. But that is what it is all about, ladies and gentlemen. That's, you have to ensure that you communicate correctly and you communicate constantly. Please mark and underline this word. Communicate constantly. Don't give them press notes only when you have to give them a press note. Give them something every time that you want them to learn something about your hospital, or about the particular procedure, or about a patient, or about anything else, or your superstar doctors. They are your superstars. Use them properly. They can go and educate people about various facets through media. And this is where I'm coming again, because unlike other sectors, a doctor cannot openly advertise his or her services. So, the question that otherwise also came up is, many of you asked in this particular one is, how do you make a career in media relations in healthcare? Now, this is a question that we get asked often. There's no particular course in India to speak of technically saying that this is only in healthcare. You know, you have a journalism degree course, various universities across the country, and then we find sessions specialized, which is in giving courses. For example, MedEduPro, which you're seeing right now, who were conducting this conference in Focus RX also, they are actually coming up with a course which helps people who want to specialize in a career in media relations in healthcare. And that is, I think, extremely important, because this is not a generalist trade. This is a skill-based trade. This is a knowledge-based trade. So we need to ensure that the people who get trained know what is what. Where is the heart? Where is the kidney? Most of it. But beyond that, there are a lot of other things which are the basics of healthcare. They don't know about it. And that is where it needs to be taught. And I think it's a great move by MedEduPro that they are kind of teaching these people. They're going to teach these people as to how this particular one is going to happen. And definitely, we need to ensure that health literature, also health literacy, is extremely important. Because quite often we see that people don't learn about healthcare. They have very, very cursory knowledge about healthcare. The health literacy is extremely important. I think that is where, as Indians, we are actually lacking a big time. Because many of us don't know the basics of healthcare. And we are, when you have half-baked knowledge, you make more assumptions than not. And that is where it comes in. So when you're out to make a career in media relations in healthcare, I think there are many other institutions which teach general stuff, but I think institutions like MedEduPro, which is organizing this particular webinar, you can contact them, and I'm sure they'll give you, because they are planning to start one. That's what they told me, to start one in this. And definitely, this is a fulfilling career. So as I said, there are very few newspapers and magazines in India which focus on healthcare, and I think it makes a lot more sense to train yourself in this so that you specialize in it. You're not jack of all trades, but you're a master of one. And that is extremely important. That is to be done. Now, I have over 10 minutes left, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have, or I can even go back and revisit some of the points that I feel that you should again know about. As I say in a presentation, when you finish a presentation and then there are no questions coming up, there are two assumptions made. The audience has understood everything, or the audience has understood nothing. So I hope it's a former, not a letter. But I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have, because some of the questions were there, in fact, the earlier thing, and some of them are related to medical writing, and I think that the team from this organization can actually answer those questions, and I'm sure they will have a lot more answers coming up there. Okay, there are a couple of points which came up as a query, so let me answer. Because in the absence of clear communication, and I have one quick question about the Indian healthcare system. May I know where RCM cycle will implement in Indian circle and medical coding? Well, I come from this field, Sachidananda Patro. I worked in the Apollo Health Street, which was then the BPO arm of Apollo Hospitals, and we dealt with RCM on the US side. It is already happening. Well, not exactly the RCM cycle. The medical coding is already happening in India. There are a lot more coding that is happening in many major healthcare initiatives. I, for example, was a part of the team a few years ago, which built the National Health Portal, and Dr. Sarvadhikari was a part of that. I'm sure Dr. Ganapati Krishna Apollo, he was a part of that. Ms. Sangeeta Reddy, now the joint managing director, she was part of that. Other teams, we led the teams into building various parts of the Indian healthcare sector. That was the big thing that we did. And I'm sure, as you rightly asked, the medical coding part of it, yes, it is not as sophisticated as the Indian code in terms of what all scripts does or what GE does and all that. But I'm sure that there are things that are happening in India, and I'm sure you'll see more the insurance part of it comes on it. And I think we will see more of medical coding coming into place. Let me just take a few other questions that are coming up. A lot of them are coming up one after another. So let me just go back and revisit some of the questions. Please hang on. One moment. One moment. So given that hospitals are of varying degree from primary to tertiary, do you think the suggestions are given? These are excellent questions, Prema. And I think, no, it is not. Horses for courses, they say. Small hospitals have issues of their own. For example, when you are in a small town, the media is not so educated. The media personnel are not so sophisticated in terms of knowledge as a city-based media group would be. And definitely, as you rightly said, we need to ensure that we answer questions to them. It may be a vernacular newspaper, for example. Now, how would you tell them what are the intricacies of a COVID patient in terms of the lung that gets impacted? How do you tell them that other issues concerning, say, a cardiac surgery? How would you tell them what is happening there? These are issues which have to be dealt at that level. And you're right about it. Yes, there are various degrees from, primary care to the tertiary care to the, you have the city-based hospitals, you have the specialties and all that. The question, Sachidanand, coming back to again, when will the Indian hospitals include this? Yes, that is the question which needs to go back to the experts. And I'm sure the team here will go check back with the hospitals and answer your question. Yes, the revenues will double, definitely. And I think the insurance companies are now insisting on the RCM part of it to come in because the revenue cycle management is extremely important in the collection of the money that comes in, the collection of the overdue payments, the collection of defaulted payments, and all this that comes up. And I'm sure there are many organizations, including Southern and Global Solutions and all that in India, you see a lot of them out here, Ajuba and others, who do this. What are the qualifications for content writer for hospitals? Well, content writer for hospitals, I'm sure this team here will answer that question better than me, but they are experts in this particular field. And I'm sure that at the end of this call, they will specifically answer your queries. From Devashri Mishra, there's a question. As you said, there are no particular subjects for particular media course for healthcare, but hospital marketing team can go for social media optimization, social media campaigns, and social media marketing as a part of the communicating with media. And I think that helps a lot. It's perfect. What you said is extremely correct, Devashri. I mean, this is something that many hospital professionals, the media professionals, the PR team, the hospitals have learned how to use your social media. And for example, they even ask you questions like, how much does it cost for a surgery? And these queries usually come from abroad or within the country. And many of the questions come through social media. Now, where people get put off often is the query comes on a Saturday evening at 6 p.m. and doesn't get answered till Monday morning 9 a.m. because people have taken a weekday off. Now, this is the question that is going to come on. And that is going to be the major problem. There is a question that comes up also on ethical code to regulate social media. Well, social media is, there are regulations that are now coming in. If you see, Twitter has put in certain strict rules. They have locked out a few politicians from their platform. The same thing happening with WhatsApp. You have WhatsApp also is. The problem with Indian laws are very lenient. People get away with what they want. And there's no ethical code. I mean, let me be very clear on this. No ethical code to regulate. Social media itself is a wild animal, slightly out of control right now. But I'm sure as time goes along, the new law, the IT law, more tough attitudes are going to come into the particular conversation on social media. What's your say on people, population getting medical accurate information in this social media? How is the government making sure that the culprits are punished for floating medically inaccurate? We saw this big time during the COVID. People coming up with various suggestions, people coming up with various treatment procedures, people coming up with various rumors. And government made it very clear there's a law in place. I don't know, many of you must not be aware of it. There's a law in place which says that if you actually put out any medically not verified information on the net, on the social media, you are punishable. Now, for a country like India with a population of 135 crores, tracking media is an extremely difficult thing, especially social media. Now, how do you do that? The question is that has been done through artificial intelligence and other means. Government is doing it, definitely. But medically inaccurate information is a big thing in social media. And government actually has brought in a law, which I told you, and sooner or later, we will ensure, or we should ensure, that people who post medical, and these are flagged. For example, in Twitter, if you put out any medically, inaccurate information, Twitter flags it saying that this is an unverified post, or this is an unverified information. So it is already happening. That continues to happen for WhatsApp. WhatsApp is a place where people circulate a lot of rumors that go wrong. And unfortunately, there's not much of a solution on that front. The questions that are still coming in, and many more are there. I think I can take them offline because we have just about a few more minutes left to end this conversation. But I'm sure that we can take a few more questions there.
Okay. I think more questions can be reverted to us after the session. In case anybody has any questions, they can always reach us out on www.onlinemedicalwriting.com. So thank you so much for your time and such wonderful insights on the topic, and attendees, wonderful questions. So thanks a lot. I think there's one more question if you're willing to take that, sir.
Prema Dekanha has a question. Are only healthcare held to moral standards and nobody else? Well, Prema, that's a good question. The problem is healthcare is held in, as I said, doctors are held up as gods. We consider healthcare. When we go down to the rural areas, we are worship. You should be prepared to take the flak for it also. So that's a problem. There are black sheep in every industry. And a few black sheep actually spoil the reputation of the entire industry. And I'm sure with people like you and others who are there, we can always convey the good news part of it. The moral standard is something that the healthcare industry has held up. And maybe other industries have not done so. And especially as you rightly mentioned, media has not done so in many cases. But then we got to live in a country like this. We are in a democracy. We are not North Korea. That's a problem. So we got to live with certain standards. Wherever possible today, you have social media to get back on these people and tell them what they're saying is wrong. So the media, if they put out the wrong news, immediately counter them with the facts. Don't wait till day after tomorrow. That is my advice.